Hey there, class. Let's discuss the elements of design. To understand the art and craft of designing, one must be familiar with the basic elements that must be developed. The basic elements of design are considered to be line, shape, color, texture, pattern, and space. Now, time has also been added as an element of design. There are 5 traditional elements of design: color, line, texture and pattern, shape, and space. And also, as mentioned, there is now the 6th element, which is time. Let's review each of these elements in a little bit more detail. Color. There are 4 basic dimensions. Hue, which is pure color as represented on a color wheel. Hue identifies the pure color on a color wheel. It can be found in an area on a simple spectrum of primary and secondary colors. Primary and secondary colors include red, violet, blue, green, yellow, and orange. Out of a hue, various colors can be created. For example, red could consist of red-orange, dark red, and even light red. Value is determined by placing color in a continuum of light to darkness, which is white to black, or brightness to darkness. This is not the same thing as the intensity of color. Intensity is a saturation of color on a surface or in a solution. It is the amount of color. For example, think about paint, makeup, or even nail polish. The amount of pigment that is used gives the color a level of intensity. Intensity creates an emotional response. Generally, the higher the color saturation, the more excitement one tends to experience. Now, your temperature is going to be those warm tones or even cooler tones. So your warm tones are those that are connected to yellow, orange, and red. Your cool tones are going to be those that are green and blue. For example, when you think about traffic lights, a red traffic light gives you a sense of urgency, while green light gives you a sense of calm and tells you that you can proceed through the intersection. A yellow light tells you to be cautious. Or even think about the spa or beach decor in a beach home. Those type of looks give a sense of calm. So color theories. Color is the result of our nervous system interpreting the energy input of varying wavelengths, such as light on the nerve ending of our eyes. Violet and blue resides at one end, and then red and yellow is at the other. The degree by which we interpret brightness is determined by the height of the race. Color systems. There are 2 types of systems. You have your subtractive systems and your additive systems. So your subtractive systems of pigments would be, for example, CMYK. We're probably all a little bit familiar with CMYK from our use of a computer, let's say, especially if you've used some sort of design software. So CMYK stands for cayenne, magenta, yellow, and key. Key is also considered the color black. So with CMYK, color is printed by using the four aforementioned colors. So these colors are referred to as spot colors. And by layering the color onto typically white paper, the ink subtracts from the reflected light to produce the hue. A black underlay controls the intensity of the color. So oftentimes when you are designing on design software, or even when you go to print from just a regular software, or even like Canva for example, it will usually ask you, are you printing a photograph? Are you printing text? What are you printing? And it will help you select the best print option based upon what you're going to be printing. So an additive system of light would be your RGB. This is also seen on a lot of our computers when we go to print items as well. So RGB is a color model that stands for red, green, and blue. Now this is called an additive because it begins with black. There's no light. And then light is added until there is a desired color, which is achieved. So oftentimes our television screens use RGB. So there are two very common color theories: the Goethe system and Munsell. So with the Goethe system, this is the most commonly known color theory out of the two. So it uses three primary colors, are red, yellow, and blue, to create an entire spectrum. Now Munsell uses green and violet as well as red, yellow, and blue. The Munsell system was developed in the 20th century. The goal was to accurately be able to describe colors using numerical references. So each color is represented by three numbers which symbolize hue, value, and chroma, also known as intensity. Munsell arranged colors into a cylindrical shape where the hues go around horizontally. Intensities are arranged from the central axis outward, and the values are arranged from the top, which are usually white, to the bottom, which is typically black. Now your Pantone color system is a system that is being considered a worldwide standard. It's also referenced a lot in the design world. So the system provides a standardization of colors by using Pantone guides. So the PMS, or the Pantone matching system, is a number system that is universal. So let's say you're designing a fabric. Now in designing this fabric, you have a particular color that you have selected. If this color that you're using is from the Pantone matching system, you can take that number pretty much anywhere and provide that number, and that same color dye can be applied to your fabric. Color schemes. So in the conception phase, designers choose a color scheme which is used when sourcing materials, such as fabrics, trimmings, and notions. The four basic dimensions of color, hue, value, intensity, and temperature, can be used as starting points. Now, monochromatic color schemes only utilizes different intensities of a single hue. So there are varying effects depending upon the dimensionality and the application of the design. The effect of a grayscale is tied to the width of the scale used. So the wider the scale, the more dramatic the effect. A narrow scale gives a sense of calm. So for example, using only grays can imply a historical reference such as an old black and white photo. It can also evoke a classic feeling. So think about when you wear maybe black and white clothing. That gives a more classic feeling. It's even thought of in a lot of cases as being the appropriate wear for a formal interview. Now, color schemes can also have a high or low value, which can create an atmosphere that feels moody or calm. Now, your high value schemes can produce a visual sense of weight. The darker and the heavier, and it will also give a sense of substance. Now, the lower value will give you a sense of more light, and therefore there will be less substance and less weight. Color in action. There are many different effects that color gives off. It can give a sense of action and movement, stillness and quiet, hot and cold. It also has cultural and nature-based associations. For instance, soothing, exciting, or joyous. With color so bound to cultural interpretation, its understanding and interpretation changes over time. The meaning of a color can change from one generation to the next if a suitable strong reference appears in a culture, such as an iconic design in fashion, or if an event is tied to the use of a color. For example, the connecting of a color to a political party or even a revolution. Line. Let's talk about the different types of lines. So you have a drawn line, which is going to be a line that is marked on a surface. There's form line, which is constructed into a design. And there's implied line, which is two or more points that are connected by associations. So lines can also indicate direction, such as horizontal, vertical, and diagonal. Now, the clarity of a line is directly related to the feel of a design. So a crisp, clear line will give a feel of effortlessness or efficiency. Elaborate or overlapping will give you depth, looseness, and motion. So lines that have shapes that convey movement and space. So lines can have different shapes that convey a sense of movement and space. You can have convex or you can have concave. They can also have varying lengths and widths that produce a sense of structure, a pattern, and a sense of motion. For example, stripes. Texture and pattern. So on a daily basis, we constantly come in contact with different textures. Our sense of world revolves around textures. We have a visual interest as well as a sense of touch that is directly related to texture and pattern. We actually engage in touch before we engage by sight. Think about a newborn baby whose eyes have not yet developed and have not yet gotten to the point, well, I shouldn't say develop, I should say gotten to the point where they are actually able to hone in and focus on things. So these newborn babies will use more of their sense of touch. So our sensory perception is not exclusive to an individual sense. So texture is experienced visually and through touch. It can also be implied on a 2D surface. So what is meant by our sensory perception not being exclusive is just that we use more than one type of sense, generally on a daily basis. So texture and pattern does provide an impact within a spectrum that contains both visual interest and the sense of touch. So from the food that we eat to the clothing that we wear. Texture is experienced and understood both visually and through touch. So it can be conveyed through a tactile description. Example, when you think about wood and leather or raw silk, when you think about these things, you already kind of have a general idea of what that touch would feel like. Texture can also be implied by illustrative means or by setting up a pattern on a two-dimensional surface. Pattern. So the use of pattern generates rhythms. 2D and 3D are built in or added on, essentially to set up rhythms. So rhythms brings order and variety to a surface or structure. Patterns are naturally seen as 2D constructs. 3D patterns are used in interiors and in architecture. So sets of lines, colors, or forms minimally organized are easily displayed a simple pattern. Shape. So the classification of shape include two areas, which are natural and ideal. So in a naturalistic approach, a designer seeks to copy the world, attempting to present an honest visual appearance of shapes in the world around us. Under idealism, the designer interprets and presents the world with a vision of how it should be. Perceived imperfections and flaws are now corrected, and certain desired characteristics are enhanced. Abstraction and non-objective forms of shape. So an abstraction shows us the essence of shape rather than a detailed description. A shape is simplified to the outline or the silhouette. So abstractions are easily incorporated into patterns, and they are best suited for mass production. Now with your non-objective shapes, these work with form in a way that uses the qualities of the shape. So these can be pure forms of basic geometry like circles, rectangles, triangles, and ellipses. So shape can also be broken down into two simple categories when looking at edges and angles. So you have curvilinear, which are rounded or curving forms. These may imply movement or softness. Then you have rectilinear, which are straight lines, which may imply stillness, hardness, and a more permanent state. Now with shapes, you also have what is considered your positive shape and your negative shape. So a positive shape is what is already presented, so what's already there. Your negative shape is the shape created around or within what is already there. So for example, when you take a look at the image of the vehicle from the text, the positive shape is pretty much the vehicle in and of itself and the pieces that make up the vehicle. But the negative shape would be the individuals that are inside the vehicle. So it is not always evident which is which when it comes to positive shape and negative shape, as some areas are not always well defined. Space and motion, 2D and 3D space. So different tricks of perception can make 2D artwork appear to be 3D. So overlapping one thing over another will give us a sense of in front and behind, which immediately conjures up 3 dimensions. Also, your vertical location will place 2-dimensional objects into a 3-dimensional relationship, especially if there are other visual cues available. So transparency also implies 3-dimensionality by showing an in front and behind relationship. Now your illusions of space and motion. So with size, so we can view the same object as being at different distances just simply based upon its size. Their surroundings are usually used to develop a sense of scale. So with vertical location, our sense of perception is trained to view the higher object as further away if it is below the horizontal line, but closer if it is above it. With transparency, again, this shows in an in front and behind relationship. So all 3 of these imply 3-dimensionality. So the language of motion. So our instinctive understanding of shapes imply motion. This is not a natural process. It is one that we acquire, and it is one that is cultural. Now, our sense of space and motion in design is thus always based on our own lived experiences that provide us with points of reference to cultural structures. Boundaries and edges. So in life, we're constantly negotiating our boundaries. So there are actual boundaries, we have physical boundaries, we have implied boundaries, emotional boundaries, and psychological boundaries. Our spaces are intertwined based on need and social structures that involve appropriateness, politeness, gender relations, and tradition. So our sense of space and the boundaries we live and move within arrives directly from our physical shape and being. We operate within planes and right angles based on the geometry of our own left-right symmetry. We have a sense of forward and back and side, front-back asymmetry, and the up-down asymmetrical orientation of our bodies. But overall, we navigate our bodies through space with a sensory orientation that is nearly 360 degrees. Virtual space. A significant portion of our lives take place in the virtual space of digital signals. So there has been a shift from the physical interaction with things to a world of signals perceived through electronic interaction, such as our iPads, computers, cell phones, and television. Time and experience as elements of design. Our sense of time has been extended by electronics. Virtually everything nowadays is accessible at all times of the day online. The user experience and designing for lived experience. Good design is thought of as that which is useful and beautiful. However, this is very subjective depending on the user or the observer. The user experience is broken down into two interrelated sides. You have the practical side and you have the emotional side. So on one hand, you have usability, and then on the other hand, you have satisfaction. So designing is a series of dialogues rather than one single dialogue. So first there's a dialogue between the between the designer and the end user in terms of addressing the constraints and needs of the design in relation to the client. And then you have the dialogue between the end user and the design object or the environment, and finally between the end user and the internalized experience or memory of the design and or environment. So experience in time. The experience we have of our surrounding and design object has 4 stages that bring us into a grown relationship. Impact, knowledge, memory, and being familiar. We are impacted on a conscious and unconscious level by sight, touch, sound, smell, emotion, and memory, creating an impression and comfort level. Information may be brought from memory because of previous experience. Otherwise, we form knowledge into memory that begins to inform future encounters with other designs. We learn through repetition to identify our responses to spaces, equipment, and products and make our choices accordingly.